Thank you again, Adrian, for having me. As everyone settles into the room, I did want to share a small piece of my story and how I got here. So I am a 23% burn survivor, and life as a pediatric burn survivor really shaped my experience, as I mentioned earlier, and led me to the nursing profession. At 20 years old, I walked into the burn unit in West Penn, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I had that brand new name badge. It was shiny. It was just everything I ever dreamt of and more. But despite my lived experience as a burn survivor, I was grossly underprepared for what I would witness. And the years in that burn unit, almost 14 years in that burn unit, they were hard and they were humbling and they were a bit blurry, as trauma tends to be. But they taught me a very powerful message that I've carried with me through my 20-year career and here today. And that is that in taking care of the dying, I would learn to live. So really from that experience, I developed it was a lot of self-help. I was seeking things that I needed. I kind of decided to dive into trauma-informed care, polyvagal theory, and it led me to academia, and I was teaching at Towson University when the pandemic began, and I began to receive a lot of calls and reach outs from former students who were 1 to 2 years in the profession. But this is what I found most interesting. Also from my colleagues from the ICU who were like 10, 12, 15 years, right? We have it all together. And for the first time, it was the first time that I was hearing nurses experiencing fear for themselves, their families, their patients, and the community at large. And 16 days after, get a little choked up on this, 16 days after a global pandemic was declared, one by one, I began debriefing the front lines. We are now a team of 3, soon to be 4 registered nurses and 1 staff. Here's kind of a timeline of what I just explained. This is a sidebar. I have a lot of sidebars in my presentation, but to date, we have facilitated almost 2,400 one-on-one debriefing sessions. 187 nurses reported being in therapy and 47% didn't respond. So I just kind of want to gauge out of that number, how many people are reporting seeking professional mental health care outside of what may be offered within organizations. As I mentioned before, we provide structured debriefing of single incident and cumulative caretaking trauma, emotional wellness offerings, sobriety support, nursing CE workshops. We do this through one-on-one sessions and hospital partnerships. We currently have hospital partnerships with West Virginia University Bridgeport campus. We're doing monthly well-being debriefings or peer supports. And then we have a contract with Memorial Healthcare in Michigan where we're doing debriefings post-critical incident. I know that this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about cumulative caretaking trauma and institutional betrayal. And I recognize that it has been a big day, right? Someone's word, I believe, was overwhelmed. So I just want to invite you to be present for yourself, both personally and professionally in this space over the next hour or so. I would like you to ponder, discover, to notice what emotions arise within you when we talk about these complex topics. And what I feel is the most important piece of this information is I invite you, alongside of myself, to be relentlessly honest about the facts and the state of our healthcare system while still being hopeful of the future. And we're going to do this formally, as Maggie said, through just discussing critical roles leaders play in creating and maintaining healthy work environments. My colleagues have set the stage for this beautifully. We're going to explore some meaningful debriefing practices as a tool for cultivating psychological safety. This is foundational. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about is, really trauma-informed communication and how to start feeling comfortable, how to assess our own needs, and how to start feeling comfortable in these uncomfortable situations so we can build a culture of safety so that when we are ready to bring in the big guns, that formal debriefing program, we have set the stage, we have set ourselves up for success. And we're gonna do a lot of reflecting on where kind of we're at emotionally in our own leadership practices. And we're gonna do this two ways, through terms, language, and tools. The terms language is the recognition of our humanness. And the tools is how we put that recognition into action in our daily practice. The first tool that we're going to talk about, it's very simple. It is something called the core emotion check-in tool. Oh, I forgot to mention, excuse me, in your folder, there is like a little workbook that you can follow along with. I probably don't have to say this, but I feel compelled that there are a few spelling errors because I'm recognizing the humanness, and Maggie pointed out that it shows that I didn't use AI. So I love that. Thank you so much, Maggie. So this is in your workbook as well. The first tool that we're going to talk about is the core emotion check-in tool. And this is basically asking your team, a group of people like this room, for example, to describe how you are feeling using one word. And this is a very simple and powerful tool because it acknowledges trauma. And that is something that is universally lacking within our daily work, right? And it echoes a collective message. It validates feelings because the words that people say will most likely be similar. It recognizes our humanity. It gives the team, it gives people the ability to experience the power of being heard without expecting anything in response. This is just someone saying, I feel overwhelmed, I feel burned out, I feel soul exhausted, whatever your word may be. And it creates a sense of safety in numbers. I also think it's great for leaders because if you do this consistently over time, it gauges where your staff is at. If every day you did this, like before huddle or, it would really give you kind of this bird's eye view of what consistently your staff is feeling. Last thing I want to mention about this, I have used this probably for a decade in many roles. I used it in a charge nurse role. I used it when I was simulation lab coordinator. Adrian and I used this, in huddle. I've used it for clinical instruction. It's really applicable in so many arenas. Oh, and every time on the slides, every time you see the little check mark, I would love for you just to jot down one word to describe how you are feeling. And if we could just dig a little deep, like, hungry, like I try not to have people say hungry, tired, like what emotion are you feeling? And if people are having a hard time expressing that, you might have to like print out the emotion wheel and share it and say, okay, these are the emotions that you might be feeling. Trauma. You guys have heard a lot of definitions of trauma, which I love our varying perspectives. This definition from The Body Keeps the Score, we've referenced that, Kolk. This is the definition that through my work, I feel is most applicable to the collective nursing profession right now. And that is trauma occurs when the nervous system experiences something that is too big, too fast, too soon, too hurtful, or too little for too long. And in my work, Debriefing the Frontlines, that really describes a lot of the pandemic experiences that the nurses have been reflecting on. It has been too little action for far too long. Trauma, it is a pervasive problem. It is spread far and wide. Every day, we are living and breathing in the aftermath of trauma. And as my colleague said, we have to recognize that we're not just seeing trauma daily, we're working with other humans who are experiencing complex layers of trauma. Cumulative caretaking trauma is when I first began debriefing the front lines, I was debriefing single incident trauma. It was really about proning and how disturbing that was for so many. And it was very respiratory single incident focused. very quickly than I ever imagined. I began to recognize patterns of what people were describing, and it was cumulative. And I'm like, this is cumulative caretaking trauma. So cumulative caretaking trauma, CCT, is the overexposure of abnormal and traumatic events with no time for acknowledgement, discussion, processing, and recovering a sense of internal safety that results in physical, emotional, and spiritual suffering. And when this suffering persists, we lose ourselves. And the only way to remedy this suffering is to restore and replenish ourselves. You know, nursing, medicine, it is so much. Every single part of it is an exchange of energy. And what we give must be replenished. And, you know, I think, on Maggie, there was, a slide that said when, Maggie asked what was some of the issues or problems that you guys are facing, judgmental patients was one of them. And I thought that was really interesting because it shows just like the cumulative trauma that nurses are experiencing. So CCT is a result of not only the overexposure of traumatic events, but the complex systemic factors that live inside of our work, that live inside the trauma that we see every day. And these are things like lateral violence, unsafe staffing, verbal abuse, limited resources, lack of debriefing, structural racism, lack of mentorship, orientation, excuse a couple typos on there. And all of these things perpetuate institutional betrayal. And institutional betrayal, I want to get that definition right. It is actions that defy the expectation for safety and violate relationships between the individual and the institution. It's a violation of trust that carries a psychological weight. There, in my presentation, and Adrian talked about it, there's like these systematic reviews of the literature of what we should do as organizations, as individuals, as communities, but we are in a very challenging place because we as healthcare workers and community members depend on the very institution that we feel is betraying us. And I'm getting some head nods, and I just want to check in with everyone because I know this is like really big and really heavy stuff. And another term that I've heard used for institutional betrayal is administrative harm. And I personally do not resonate with that term because this is like also social justice and political, like it's not just administrative harm. What am I missing from this here? What am I missing? Yes.
To address the administrative harm part, I think, so Sharon and I really rolled what half on the floor, half in administrative. And I constantly feel that things that we should be doing versus things that I'm being told I have to do that take up that time. So these are things that I would like to be doing. But I'm not allowed, I don't have that time allowed to do so because we have one foot in each door. It's a very unique position.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how that resonated when you said that. I've never heard that term before, but that's how that resonated with me. That we're at a point where the needs of administration are harming staff because we're being told how our time is supposed to be spent. We're not being allowed to spend it the way we think it should be spent with the staff that we're on the floor with having.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective. I agree that you're in a unique situation because you're on the floor and then also a leader.
So that's how that resonates.
Yeah.
Like you said that I never heard that before, but that's how that resonates with me.
I wanted to ask, so when you say, I've heard that term like once or twice before, but in my previous role at a health system, I didn't have like administrative oversight over anyone, but I worked with a lot of people obviously that did in my role in quality and safety. And, I know that they laid up for hours at night, like stressing about how they needed to actually like articulate this stuff to their team. Because, so the harm, like these institutions, so when I think about institutional harm, it's not like one person. It's not, it's just how it all fits together, because that even is outside of like the actual institution of your hospital or your organization, like, so to get really like macro,
Yes.
you know, I think, okay, well, we would love to give more resources to patients in the perinatal space, but perinatal service line doesn't really make money. You know, we might make money in our NICU, so there's a lot of money coming in, and then how do we get these resources? So we're trying to work with a small amount of money. So I mean, it goes like even outside of the institution of your
Absolutely.
hospital, but to just the institution. like
You wanna
they're-
create a term and a theory and a trademark?
That's what we're so caught in the middle, because we empathize with the staff, we empathize with our direct management, because we know that the things that they're telling us, like you said, that we have to do are coming from people who are many more steps removed. So you're defending the actions of administration to the staff.
But it doesn't always make sense to you.
When
Right.
it always
Yes,
makes
right,
sense,
yes.
but I know it doesn't, I don't agree with it, but I understand the pressures of the people directly above me. But I also see the injustice of where
Yeah.
people who are so far removed are making decisions about things that they don't know anymore, never did to begin with.
Yep.
Yeah, and it sounds like a little bit of like moral injury.
Right, for everyone.
Everybody.
I think what Adrian mentioned is so true, that like having to come up with the business case. And where's the revenue in this?
Well,
And there may not be. And
You're
it
doing it
may
just
be,
for good.
it may be neutral, but in the long run, we're not gonna be reacting to something a few years later because we didn't do that neutral revenue generating.
well, and in this space, that's like
Improve.
the big thing, right? I mean, my previous CEO, he always said, like, everything's about follow the money, right? I mean, like, and if you think about it in the perinatal space, a lot of the things that we're struggling with, like maternity care deserts, you know, social determinants of health, access to care. I mean, it all goes back to, I mean, if you get to the brass tacks of quality and safety, there are no quality and safety measures that are tied to reimbursement in the perinatal space. Not one right now. I think that's gonna change. I think it's coming soon. But in the current state, that's not what's driving, I mean, that's what drives a business, right? And a hospital is a business. And unfortunately, how do we navigate through that? And I think, you know, taking this concept and translating it specifically to the perinatal space, that's the rub that then gets down to like those folks trying to work with their staff and administrators, the administrators trying to run a business and not really understanding like how this is flowing downhill,
Yeah.
and then how the staff feel betrayed.
And it's interesting that it appears to me, this is my humble opinion, it appears to me that, you know, we leaders, administrative, C-suite, whatever you wanna call that, they're not maybe looking at the big picture, and it's looking at short-term, cost-saving measures, because the literature, I go over another slide, but it seems appropriate for here, the literature is there. For every one vacant nursing position, it costs the hospital $52,300 and some dollars. For every 1% increase of turnover, it costs the hospital $360 some thousand more a year. Most hospitals are 6.2 to 10.5 million dollars in the hole. And this is all through the national safety report that some of your hospitals, I think, have participated in. It's like 293 hospitals were surveyed. So the data of how creating these spaces can help, the intersection between creating safe spaces and retention is there. It's like, how do we deliver it? I don't have all the answers, but I hope to be part of the solution. Yes.
This is just an example of where I think social injustice plays out. So on Friday, I was in a meeting with our national leaders, and Dr. Rappi was at the national legislative meeting somewhere in the Midwest. She's I don't know, whoever has worked with Dr. Rath, she texts constantly. And we are talking about reducing blood usage. That's what we were talking about in the meeting. She's texting me that she's hearing from her ACOG colleagues that in states where there are strong abortion bans, administrations are taking misoprostol off the hemorrhage parts. And my head exploded.
That is happening.
And then I'm thinking about, so we go to our frontline staff.
And we tell them we're taking away a big tool in your toolbox to prevent hemorrhage.
Right, but we want you to advocate for us so that we don't look bad in the SMMs, you know.
That's a good example.
You know, I
So
just,
does that look-
it blew my head. It just-
And that goes though, even above this institution.
Right,
So like.
governmental institution and beyond, you know, professional organizations, like, they're working to try to correct this, but I was blown away.
It's kind of like the same thought line of like, okay, well-being is not just one person, it's well-becoming, it's your community, it's your social determinants, it's, you know, your socioeconomic class, like it's all of this is very big picture, and that's why sometimes I get really nervous to present it, because like there is no one solution. It's really a conversation that we need to continue to have and start to feel comfortable having.
See, we're
This
with you, Tara.
Yes.
This conceptual picture is really strong.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. I made that and then I was like, oh God, I should hire a graphic designer. Yes, like how do we untangle this ball of yarn?
She texted me last week, she's like, I'm really worried to talk about this. I'm like, don't worry. The ambiguity.
Yeah, just when I talk to bedside nurses, like, yeah, you know, they're a little bit. Yes, so I appreciate you guys being able to have this honest conversation. So regarding cumulative caretaking trauma, these are the manifestations that we see, and they're very similar to kind of what Maggie talked about with freeze and fawn. But they're deeply rooted in our nervous system, and it's not being able to delineate where one trauma ends and the other begins, because like frankly, it all hurts like hell, right? And inability to rest. Oh, we see that not being able to delineate the traumas. We see a correlation with that between the type of setting that you're in, so critical care, ER, ICU, and OB, as well as the number of years of service. Because think of when you're 20, 30, 40 years in, cumulatively, how much you and your nervous system have experienced, right? And living in a state of sympathetic activation, you're experiencing somatic symptoms, your neck hurts, your back hurts, but you know, anatomically, everything is okay. Feelings of shame, guilt, grief, unworthiness that kind of seep into life outside of work. We call this the spillover effect. Exacerbation and episodes of flashbacks of personal and childhood trauma outside of nursing. This is huge. I need to get my notes because I want to get the stat right. 68% of healthcare workers report experiencing childhood trauma before the age of 13. This is a study outside of Duke University National Center for Child Traumatic Stress. It was a very small survey, but it's a survey nonetheless. 769 healthcare workers responded to this survey. 68% of healthcare workers experienced childhood trauma before age 13. A statistic that we have is Debriefing the Frontlines. 53% of our almost 2,400 debriefing sessions, 53% of our nurses that come to us mention childhood trauma unprompted on their intake form. We have a question. Is there anything else you want us to know about yourself? Very open. 53% of people write something about childhood trauma. Persistent limiting beliefs, like I'm not a real nurse, so if I don't if I'm not a nurse manager, or if I'm not leading the team, or if, I don't work in labor and delivery, lots of limiting beliefs around it. For many years, I thought the only nurse I should ever be was a burn nurse. If I wasn't a burn nurse, I wasn't good enough. So I had to prove myself. Very, very deep limiting beliefs. Thank you, Hannah, my therapist. You're paralyzed in your trauma. And you'll see this as decision fatigue. Do you ever get home after a long day and like, you have a fridge full of things you can make, meat, chicken, everything. And you cannot decide what to eat.
Can't tell what the name of this was. I did not know what this was. And
You are having decision fatigue and you're paralyzed in your trauma. Dark sense of humor, right? And detachment, disconnection, and isolation. It's really important to remember. Of course, it has its place. But detachment is not a measure of professionalism. It is a fast track to secondary trauma, right? Am I missing anything from those manifestations? I don't call them signs and symptoms because this is not a clinical diagnosis. I feel like that's a disclaimer. When I was learning to become a teacher, they said you ask a question and then you wait 10 seconds. That is a really long, that's a long time. Long time. Did they tell you that?
They did,
Yeah.
they did, I can't keep that. But every time we talk about all this stuff, I always feel really seen, like she'll post something on LinkedIn, I'm like, you writing that to me? That's me, like, it's not really like you were talking to me, Sarah.
You look like you might have something to say, but no pressure.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about your 67%, 68%.
Yes.
I think it's higher than that.
Yeah, that was in 2012. There's very limited research. If you'd like to get into that.
I had to do this pre-work assignment before I started graduate school, and it was to write an essay about how I got to where I was. And then we had to summarize and present at our first day of class. And I think there were, in my class, 24, my coworkers like 24, 25. There was childhood trauma that was in the, decision-making process for every single nurse in the room.
Welcome to the first day, right?
Yeah, and it was a really good exercise because it allowed us to know where we were all coming from and put us in a similar like plane. And it, I don't know how you ask the question in a work environment, but it is. It allows.
It's eye-opening,
for-
right?
yeah, It allows for that humility,
But
right?
you know what, Sarah, remember when we were working together and the thing that we talked about a lot was like, what nursing students, like, so if this is true for nurses, and it was obviously true for nursing students. And so being a faculty and like trying to navigate that, but then let's just take that same thing and translate it to like your new to practice nurses and understanding that 68% of them are coming to their work with childhood trauma. What's the impact of that on our coping skills, our resiliency, all of those things, and how you handle trauma in the workplace? And that puts a whole different frame around the toolbox that they're bringing and how they're reacting in situations and their behavior at work or in my classroom. And so that really just reframed like how I needed to be like in partnership with them in the classroom. I didn't need to solve their problems because I was not going to be able to do that, but I needed to use a little bit of a different like way to come together with them when understanding like why something bad went wrong or why they cheated or why they did something. It wasn't just because they were being a bad student or something like that. And it just helped me, just that statistic and understanding that helped me to think of different ways of being with them.
Yeah, and it's not an excuse, and it's like, how do we, become professional caregivers versus
Right.
Yes.
meshing ourselves in and trying to solve all the problems because we can't.
Back to that safety expectation setting.
Yeah.
You know?
And we talk a lot about that throughout the slides too. How do we manage ourselves, our own emotional regulation, and how do we not over-identify
Yes.
with our staff? Talk a lot about that, excuse me. Thank you guys for engaging. I really appreciate it. I do a lot better when there's like an energy exchange, so yes, I appreciate it. So we've kind of talked a lot about this, but you know, how does cumulative caretaking trauma show up in your own leadership practice? I want you to reflect on this. And how do leaders, like this is a big undertaking. How do leaders foster a culture of safety, role model empathy, encourage open retaliation-free communication, and uncover vulnerabilities to prevent harm to their patients and the staff? Okay, and still take care of themselves. Like, is there any room left? You know? So how do we do that? Again, me, don't have all the answers. I'm on a continual healing journey, just for a reminder here. And there is a, you'll see the check mark there if you want to jot down one word to describe how you're feeling. So, okay, every time I talk about self-compassion, I get a little nervous because it can feel a little fluffy, and maybe that's my own projection. Because personal share, the mere word self-compassion about 10 years ago just annoyed me. It really annoyed me. And, you know, I thought that it was too fluffy, and I thought that I needed more depth. And that was exactly the truth. I needed to evoke the depth inside of me. And ironically, that could only be done with self-compassion. So one day I was talking to my therapist again, Hannah, thank you. And, she started to talk to me about self-compassion using like frameworks and language that resonated with me instead of just like self-compassion. Like, what is that? Take care of yourself. So really quickly, I want to kind of share, if you guys don't know these, this is the work of just beautiful researcher, Dr. Kristen Neff. And the three components of self-compassion are loving kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. And loving kindness is showing yourself the same love and compassion that you give to others, right? Speaking to yourself the same way that you would speak to a friend. Common humanity, this principle, especially as a burn survivor, like really kind of changed my perception in what I thought alone was. So common humanity is just recognizing that we are human, that we all make mistakes, that we all have shortcomings. And this is part of the human experience. And it is something that is happening to us. It is something that is happening to the collective, not just like me and me alone. Why me is this happening? And then the third is mindfulness. And I feel as if the word mindfulness is used so often, especially within like the healthcare wellness space, that we forget what mindfulness actually is, right? And mindfulness is a non-judgmental, receptive state of mind in which we are the creators of. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to dive into the three components of self-compassion is because I wanted to talk about the opposite of mindfulness, which is the theory of over-identification. Again, opposite of mindfulness. The theory of over-identification is when we confuse compassion and we over-identify with others' suffering. Meaning we take on what others feel. And I am absolutely not speaking for the two of you, but I would have a sense that because you're on the unit and you're also in leadership, you are biologically probably taking on some of what your colleagues are feeling because you feel it so deeply too. So there are two modes to over-identification: the sympathetic mode and the defensive mode. So I want to share with you guys this theory of over-identification. It actually started with when we over-identify with our patient, okay? Or like bedside nurses, we over-identify with our patients. But I did a leadership forum at Hershey Penn State, and I used the word patient, and they said, Tara, I love this theory, but I think as leaders, we we relate to it more as like, we take on the emotions of our staff. So for this theory, I've kind of changed it and modified it, adapted it, whatever you want to call it, for the staff. So sympathetic mode is the needs of the staff trigger a sympathetic response in you. You're over-identifying because you care so much because you're human. You feel what your staff does. Their fears and their anxieties become yours. And it's hard to identify yourself, even on your days off, you're working, you're thinking about Sally and Susie and the traumatic event that happened. And you aren't doing anything wrong, but how do we delineate from these traumas? How do we separate ourselves? And the defensive mode. This is when the staff's demands, which because of the state of our system, I'm sure many of you are probably feeling this a little bit. The staff's demand cause anxiety in you, leading to self-protective behaviors. This might mean emotional distancing. You're like not as vulnerable as you once was. You can't even think about starting the core emotion check-in right now. Like there is no space for that, right? Withdraw, excessively task-oriented. Derogatory labeling, maybe like demanding or uncooperative. Gonna be really honest, sometimes I find myself saying, which this is hard to admit, but sometimes in debriefing, I'll be like, say to myself, like, that client is really needy, like, they're needy. And that is essentially derogatory labeling because I am over-identifying with them and have entered into the defensive mode. So I fully believe that awareness precedes change. So again, I don't have all the answers, but just being aware that these modes exist. We aren't just tired. There's something happening. We're entering a mode. There's a theory occurring, right? Yeah. And this produces anger, which leads to guilt and shame because we aren't operating in the way that a nurse should be or a physician should be operating, right? And this leads to moral injury. So I'm curious, your thoughts on over-identification and these modes. Any thought that's coming to mind, like, hey, Tara, that's BS, no, like anything. Do you find yourself operating or saying any of these things or feeling these things?
I mean, I feel like personally for myself, I flip-flop between both sympathetic and defensive. Like all of the time, like, and we just had a new hospitalist program show up at the hospital, right? So like, the staff is here, so then we're triggered to here because like leadership has these demands and we're kind of the middle field and we're like, we feel you, but also like, but then also you have been complaining and your anxiety is so much that now I'm like, oh my God, I'm just gonna shut my door and turn the lights off so nobody comes, but I also want to be available to you because that's my job, but like, so you get in like, I feel like consistently in the leadership, you're just in between the two modes, like, and it's just where do you find the balance? And where do you find like you said, the time for self-care, you don't have the time for it, like you just, you don't, and you can say, oh, you need to make it. You can try and make it, but then how do you make it without feeling guilty? So it's like, you're just in between these two modes. It's like light, current. I literally actually just sent the slide to our labor and delivery manager, and I was like, I'm pretty sure she made this page for me. I literally just took the picture and sent it to her, and I was like, she knows how to.
Yes, that is a great point to make that I forgot to make, in that you don't always stay in defensive, you don't always stay in sympathetic, you ebb and flow, and the mode that we are supposed to be, we want to be in, we strive to be in, is the holistic mode where we're regulated and we're feeling well. But yeah, very normal to ebb and flow. But this is also cumulative too, like you're tired.
I was just gonna say, the thing that I resonate with is that flip-flopping back and forth, but the one that I think tends to bother me the most is the defensive mode.
Because it's not like how we want to be, how we should be. It's not that image of a caring, compassionate nurse that we dreamed of being 30 years ago or 20 years, you know. Any other thoughts on this? Again, I really appreciate the honest discussion. I know this is tough stuff. I don't think I can leave this So we talked about this, I should have brought that up so you guys could see, but, you know, where do you find yourself operating in? And, you know, I guess the challenge, what I want you to leave here and do is when you find yourself like in the defensive mode, when you find yourself saying these things, like, even if it's a micro moment, a micro, those are called glimmers, like a micro moment of joy, a micro moment of peace, a neuro drill, like, what can you do? And this is very individualized. And I'm not gonna stand up here and say make time, because that's just annoying, right? So,
Can you go back to the slide that shows the comparison between that has defensive and sympathetic, yes, that one.
yes. So these are the components of self-compassion. These are kind of like how, if we ideally were, you know, perfect human beings, we would operate, you know, with love, with recognition of our humanness, with presence, with awareness. And over-identification is that opposite. We're over-identifying with others.
So if you catch yourself and you understand that you're operating in the defensive mode, what are some strategies to move you back to the side of light?
Yeah, I like that, the sign of like, you know, that is very individualized, and that's like with our one-on-one clients, we work with a lot of clients to decide what works for you, what has personally worked for me, because I'm like a language person, is I say, okay, the nervous, if I'm practicing self-compassion, the nervous system is saying, Tara, I am having a biological response. And then self-compassion says, may I find peace in this moment. May I bring awareness to this moment. May I take a deep breath in this moment. Like, I need affirmation and reminders for myself, or else I am a spaz. That's what works for me. I also think that there are, you know, much harder, not in the moment, techniques, like, you know, 20 years of therapy, like obviously all of those things. But kind of these turnkey affirmations, like reorienting yourself. Like, I feel like this because I'm having a biological response. May I be kind to myself?
So one of the things that I have noticed just in leaders that I've worked with is it's really important to set boundaries. And I've seen progressions with leaders that I've worked closely with, and them previously maybe not having any boundaries, and then them learning to set those boundaries. And, you know, so I don't know where everyone is in that space, but I do think boundary setting is helpful in terms of getting you to the point where maybe those modes don't, like, you don't take on as much.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think that's probably different for everyone and how you set a boundary, but I think it's an important thing to really think through, like, what's that boundary for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm doing a presentation on Monday about boundaries and then kind of doing some work around that. And it's interesting that boundaries just, the topic of boundaries just started within the late 1980s. So I think that could also contribute to what Adrian was saying with like this generational gap too, and just the comfortability of placing boundaries, and why we may think that newer nurses are, you know, being difficult or what. They've been taught that, and maybe our generation hasn't been taught that. You know?
And then boundaries got blurred in the pandemic.
Very much so.
Because
Yes.
some of us were sent home and were working from home and there was no turn off. And some of us were living separate from our families. And I think it turned boundaries upside down.
Absolutely. I've read this thing that said, boundaries teach people how to love you. And I was like, wow, wow, that is like a really beautiful way of thinking about it. I mean, maybe not in your leadership role, you might change the word love to like respect you or something like that. But I just thought that was a really beautiful takeaway about like why boundaries matter so much. Okay, so all of these like really heavy topics regarding institutional betrayal, regarding cumulative caretaking trauma, they give us the opportunity to get our megaphone out and start discussing institutional courage. If you're not familiar with the Center of Institutional Courage, I highly recommend you like signing up for their emails. They won't spam you. It is such a beautiful organization, beautiful messaging. Psychologist Jennifer Fry is the executive director of that organization. And institutional courage is a pledge to protect and care for those who depend on the institution. So that's those inside, right? That is the staff, the nurses, everybody, as well as the patients. It's an institution's commitment to seek the truth and engage in moral action despite unpleasantness, risk, and short-term costs. We talked about short-term costs a little bit. It's a pledge to protect and care for those who depend on it. It's really the compass. It's orienting us to the common good of individuals, institutions, and the world. And it's a force that transforms institutions into more accountable, equitable, and effective places for everyone. And I know that this sounds really big, like, okay, how can I show institutional courage? But I firmly believe that institutional courage lives in these conversations that we're having right now. I believe it lives in, saying yes to the commitment that the invitation that Adrian is going to share with you all. I think it means changing policies and procedures, even though we've always done it that way. I think institutional courage is using those like turnkey statements. I think it's trauma-informed communication. Right? So I want you to think about how can you, baby steps, show institutional courage? And it might be like showing up here today. This is another kind of big concept, but there are a few hospitals across the country that have implemented a restorative justice program. And restorative justice is an approach to repairing harm based on dignity, healing, and community. It has been used for centuries by Indigenous communities, and it has a wide range of applications. It's used for clinical and ethical dilemmas, disagreements between individuals, mistreatments of students, and reintegration after a traumatic event. And really what I want you guys to focus on, because I think it will help when we're in those modes of over-identification, is these questions. Who was harmed? What are their needs? Who is responsible for making things right? Remember, you can share resources, but you don't, and we're gonna show this in some of the skits that we do, but you don't have to have all the answers, right? So really identifying with yourself, who is responsible for making things right? And this isn't my job type mentality. It's just like big conversations as to who is responsible and how can we work together to repair the harm. Again, very big picture, but I hope you'll kind of take away some of these questions in an effort to practice a little bit more self-compassion and in turn maybe mitigate some of these deep feelings of over-identification that eventually lead to cumulative caretaking trauma. The principles of restorative justice, I'm not going to get too far into this, but note that the first one is invitation for participation. Okay. I don't have a lot of time left. Okay. We are going to talk a little bit about debriefing. And, there are many kind of high level definitions of debriefing, but one that that really resonates is debriefing is through guided self-reflection. It offers clarity surrounding critical incidents or experiences and assists in establishing a process for recovering a sense of safety in the aftermath of trauma. Debriefing is really kind of this, it has a trifold purpose that links safety, patient and staff alike, quality, the outcomes, and staff wellness retention. I had to start by retention because I wanted to tell you that kind of financial stat, which I already shared. And, I think as leaders, we are sometimes intimidated by debriefing because we want to do it right. We think that there has to be, a script. We think we have to ask this like classic question, like what went right, what went wrong? But that is not the case at all. Debriefing can be used in our daily work. And it helps us kind of meet goals, address challenges, and pursue opportunities. Of course, it helps in identifying medical errors, all of those things that we know of debriefing. But if there's like any takeaway for you today, I want you to start thinking about how debriefing and how these trauma-informed techniques can kind of help set a foundation for creating a culture of safety. If you went in tomorrow and was like, we're starting a formal debriefing program, it would probably be really hard because there aren't like these other measures in place that have set yourself up for success. So, we ask all our clients, what do you hope to gain from debriefing? This is a client perspective that I wanted to share. It was kind of a sidebar because I thought that didn't have enough slides, but obviously it is. So I just kind of wanted to share a little bit with you about what we are hearing from our clients, which I find interesting because we are a third-party organization. I am not their boss. I am not their leader. It doesn't matter what they tell me. Adrian talked a lot about the systematic review of the literature, and I did too, like what is being said that we need, and that's individual resources, organizational resources, and external support. This is a great article. It just came out by the Journal of Biological Sciences, and it just came out like at the end of August. And the reason this article is so great is because it talks a lot about what is needed, but also so just like courageous in talking about the barriers that that a collective workforce is experiencing in implementing these 3 resources. So how do we start laying the foundation? How do we begin communicating with our staff in a way that is authentic to us? And I firmly believe, and I've been using a lot of these statements for like the past 15 years or so in my career, is that we create these turnkey, ready-to-use statements. Important to note, just because they are rehearsed does not mean that they are inauthentic. We as humans need that repetition. We need consistency because then when you are in these uncomfortable situations, you are ready with a response. You don't have to think of anything, right? In the burn world, they call that burn peer support world. When people ask, hey, how did you get burned? You have your 2-cent statement, your 5-cent statement, and your 10-cent statement, depending upon who you're talking to or how you feel. Is it safe enough to give the 10-cent statement? Is that person worthy of it? So again, just because it's rehearsed doesn't mean it's not authentic. And you guys have these in your workbook, and Maggie and I are going to very vulnerably do 6 skits where we are going to showcase how we are going to use these kind of turnkey statements to start creating and build relationships with our staff. Do you all, just glancing at these, do you all find these uncomfortable, or do you feel like you are able to communicate in this manner?
I think they're framed well. Anybody already do that?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I love to hear that. I think I start off every email of like someone, like the briefing client saying like, thank you for sharing this with me and knowing it's a safe space to do so. It is rehearsed, but I 100% mean it. And then also we have some more here, which Maggie, again, in your workbook, and Maggie and I are going to demonstrate. So to close, I want you all, if you wrote down, every time you saw the check mark, if you wrote down one word to describe how you were feeling, I want you to kind of just reflect back privately, personally, reflect back on your words. You know, what story does this create about your experience? I have a summary here for you. If you don't take anything from what I said, I want you to really take away that self-compassion is a vehicle for for systems change, for social change, and may your commitment to service always include yourself. In your folder, there's an extensive list of mental health resources. There's also a QR code in your workbook, so you can have those resources digitally as well. You can explore Debriefing the Frontlines website, and like Maggie, I really value your feedback. You know, never doubt the power of your own voice. I change these presentations based on your feedback. So if you have the time and space, I would love for you to hear what you have to say. And if this speaks to you, we have a daily communication initiative. It is a daily affirmation, because y'all know I love words, a daily affirmation sent in the morning. We have around 300 or so nurses subscribed, and you will get this. You have the ability to respond should you need a little bit of extra support. This is me every single morning on the other end. This is not a robot. So if you need extra support, and you can, I wanted to print my cards, but they weren't ready anyway. If you want to share this, or I can email this to Adrian, and you can put this in the break room. We can take unlimited participants. In your workbook, you'll also find, this, I wasn't gonna go over this, but in your workbook, you'll also find a COPA head plan. This is a beautiful dialectical behavioral therapy tool that you could actually give or go over with your staff if you feel like they're having a moment. And essentially, it's, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling alone. It's first I will, next I will, then I will, last I will. Like, it is an actual plan that creates safety, so that when those feelings of anxiety come, it's like, oh, I got my plan. I got my COPA head plan. Our clients like absolutely go, they love this. It's very
I've heard
simple.
people tell me, I've heard people say they use this before, like if you had somebody who's like had this, who like maybe a staff was in a traumatic event and they have to just get them, like, get them to home, or like what they're gonna do once they go home.
Yes,
Like, that's.
yeah, very simple, but very like, let's reorient.
Uh-huh.
And that was all I had to share with you
Go
guys.
back to your evaluation one, because I think people were
Oh,
trying
I'm
to,
sorry.
trying to scan
Yes.
it for you, and,
Whew.